During World War II, why did the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 have such a narrow undercarriage when there was such an obvious flaw? That's the question I will attempt to answer in this video. So welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm your host Chris, you might know me as Bismarck, and some weeks ago I actually came out with my Inside the Cockpit on the Messerschmitt Bf-109E, filmed at the Deutsche Museum Flugwerft Schleißheim. In the first cut of that video I actually had a section about the Bf-109's gear, because it has such a notorious reputation nowadays, but that scene didn't make the final cut, mainly because it was too long and went off topic. So I want to tackle the gear today. When it comes to this topic, the first thing we should recognize is that when the Bf-109 came out, retractable landing gears was the newest of the new and everybody wanted one, except of course for those making up the inevitable counter movement. Now the Soviet I-16 is largely credited with being the first noteworthy mass-produced aircraft in the same weight class as the Bf-109 to have a retractable gear. Due to the corresponding reduction in drag, it's easy to say why so many companies aiming to achieve governmental contracts for military aircraft wanted to use them. At the same time, it took another 5 or so years for the practice to actually become largely standardized, mainly because of the added complexities with such gears that they put on aircraft designers. To understand why the 109 got the gear it's had, you really need to look at the why, at the design history of the aircraft. This doesn't necessarily start with the 109 itself, it actually doesn't do it all. We need to set the stage for the 1930s first. This is a little excursion, but please bear with me for this one. Many will point, for example, to the Bf-108 as Messerschmitt's inspiration for the many aspects of the Bf-109, including the gear. After all, the 108 was the first Messerschmitt design to have a retractable landing gear. It's only natural we start there then, no? Wrong. If we do that, we are getting way ahead of ourselves. In order to understand how the Bf-108 influenced the Bf-109, you need to look at the 1920s and 30s and how they influenced the Bf-108. Now, retractable landing gears go as far back as 1911, when Glenn Curtiss designed the A1 Triad, a seaplane which also featured a moving gear. Supposedly because it could operate on air, sea and land, the name Triad was chosen for the plane, but a retractable undercarriage did not really become common for a long time. If you look at comparable planes during the 1920s and 1930s, before the Bf-108 and Bf-109 were produced, you will find a plethora of single-engine aircraft. Many of them follow similar design trends. And the most obvious one is that they are biplanes and taildraggers. Looking closer at the gear, you'll also notice that the vast majority, exceptions apply of course, it's the interwar period, after all they tried nearly everything, but the majority of them feature quite a narrow undercarriage. In fact, this is something we already see during World War I or before. The distance between the wheels is very often little more than the horizontal cross-section of the fuselage. Even as fixed gear started to wander away from the fuselage itself, they stayed relatively close, and often multiple gear struts dispersed part of the impact force away from the wing into the fuselage. There are multiple reasons for this, but the main ones are simplicity, design requirements, and the brunt of takeoff and landing that forces you to put them there on the very old machines. It took a very special arrangement, sometimes seen in some of the bigger machines, for a plane to move the gear towards the wings during World War I or after it. Even in the 1920s and 1930s, most designs stayed true to this philosophy, although the gear was now often set at a greater angle away from the fuselage so as not to be so narrow. With time, some planes with single gear struts set these in the wings. They existed, like the P-26, the Henscher 123, the Fokker D-21, but they are not as common, and generally the strut was a lot closer to the fuselage than later designs with moving gears. The point here is that aircraft designers were used to a short distance between the wheels, with the struts connected to the fuselage rather than the wings, and used this configuration well for good reasons. The main reason was, of course, that viable retractable gears were not yet designed, but such gear also produced disadvantages. First, the mechanism was complex, and a malfunction in a retractable gear would result in a damaged or lost plane. A fixed gear doesn't have that risk. Even if you used a retractable gear, you are forced to move a lot of weight into the wing, which, that would have to be significantly strengthened. That ups the complexity and the weight and the costs. And beyond the complexity and beyond the costs, you have issues with aircraft control. More weight in the wings means that you are affecting the handling of the aircraft. Now, during the interwar period, a retractable landing gear was not, I shall say, that important just yet. You're still able to get a lot of performance leaps, well, maybe not leaps, but steps ahead in the right direction with upgrading the engine and getting sort of conventional designs that existed at the time, like biplanes, to up their performance by playing around with the aerodynamics or by, well, putting a bigger horsepower engine into the machine. But at some point, you're going to get diminishing returns. And we're seeing that in the 1930s when suddenly we shift from the biplane to the monoplane and the retractable landing gear reduces a lot of extra drag, and now suddenly you can get a lot more bang for your buck. You've now seen that narrow undercarriages during these early years of aviation were quite normal. Designers were used to them, they got used in nearly all of the designs, and they also had advantages. That's something now I'll explore with the Bf 108. I've got one of the official manuals right here. Now this aircraft does have a retractable gear, and it was one of the first to do so in Germany. The gear on the 108 was manually raised and lowered. The hand crank between the two front seats could be moved forward and backwards. This input then was translated to the gear via two drive worms, which in turn drove the gear segments at the upper end of the strut. And the gear itself also had an oil-damped shock absorber. And if you're interested in the 108, I also have an inside cockpit on that aircraft. Now what's important here is now, well, look at the position of the gear. It fits into a space directly between the main plane, the wings, and the fuselage. Now we can suppose that perhaps because this was Messerschmitt's first aircraft with a gear of this kind, that they didn't really know about the general advantages of having a gear situated further outward, swinging away from the fuselage like we see, for example, in the I-16, rather than towards it. But well, that's a possibility. I don't think it really answers why the 108 has this design, because the general knowledge already existed that if the gear is situated further out, that this generally allows the aircraft to have better handling, even if the gear is not retractable. So that doesn't really explain why they chose to go this way. The reason why they decided to have this gear so close to the fuselage, in my mind, was to provide a more simpler, lightweight aircraft that was simultaneously easier to maintain. Now, having the gear swing away from the fuselage would automatically necessitate the gear, of course, to be in the wing. And that would require a stronger wing construction, able to bear the loads and the shocks imposed on the wing, especially during takeoff and landing. And this increases then the complexity of the design, the weight, and so on. Thus, by placing the gear closer to the fuselage, this could be avoided, and the design could be simpler. There was actually an additional benefit here that we tend to completely ignore nowadays. With the gear connected to the actual fuselage, you could move the aircraft's main body even if the wings are detached or folded, depending on the aircraft we're talking about. The 108, as many planes at the time, had a relatively easy mechanism to detach the wings, and when you do that, well, the fuselage doesn't need to be propped up. The gear already supports us. So that way, considering how things are done at the time, and done for good reason, the 108 introduces a retractable gear without the disadvantages of excessive weight and extra maintenance hours if the wings have to be replaced. In this sense, Messerschmitt actually translated the thinking of the time into a novel design, and it's the I-16 really that's the rebel, and not the 108. Now, I admit that in a civilian aircraft, this maintenance advantage is somewhat questionable. But in a military aircraft like the 109, where you might need to do maintenance on a wing or replace it in a suboptimal operational environment, this could actually be an advantage. I can think of another example of how this could be an advantage. Take, for example, the American or the United States F4F Wildcat, for example. And you see that the plane also has that narrow undercarriage that goes into the fuselage, and thus it could fold its wings completely. And this greatly assisted storage on the US carriers, but at the same time, the plane could still be moved. There you go. That's an advantage that generally nowadays we don't really think about that much anymore. Let's switch it up to the 109 then. The 109 was drawn up in 1934, and Messerschmitt's thinking for the machine was, well, twofold. He wanted a simple, lightweight design with excellent, even record-setting performance, and likewise the construction and the maintenance should be straightforward. With the Bf 109, Messerschmitt pretty much got that. A machine that was mass-producible and maintenance-friendly for the time. The wings of the 109 were not very gear-friendly in the first place and were, well, essentially designed only to be able to store that gear, but not much more than that. Now, before we go on to the next section, let me make something very clear. The Bf 109's gear wasn't great. It had issues, and I'm not saying that these didn't exist, but it's not as bad as sometimes is made out to be. That doesn't make it good. It's still not that great, but there is a difference between not great and fatal flaw. The main problem with this type of gear is one that haunts old tail draggers. Compared to tricycle configurations, tail draggers always have a basic instability problem, especially when they have a swiveling tail wheel. To quote here from Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators, page 307, the inherent stability problem exists because the center of gravity is aft of the point where the main side forces are deployed. At high rolling speeds, where aerodynamic forces are significant, the aerodynamic directional stability of the aircraft resists the ground looping tendencies. The most likely times for ground loop exist when the rolling speeds are not high enough to provide a contribution of the aerodynamic forces. Depending on the pilot, the experiences may vary. On the 109, a few quotes here from people that flew the aircraft spring to mind. The 109 had a big drawback, which I didn't like from the start. It was that rackety, I always said rackety, undercarriage, that negative against the rules of statics undercarriage that allowed the machine to swing away. The Bf 109's landing gear has been blamed for the swing without a cause. The real reason has been between the stick and the seat. The whole swing problem was a mere instructional mistake. The pilot should have been made to adopt one golden rule. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 must be steered to go absolutely straight during the ground run, in takeoff and landing, and any tendency to swing must be corrected immediately with a well-timed use of the brakes and or the rudder. The 109 had, not for us, maybe not for the long-time pilots of the 109, but the newcomers had problems starting with the gear. You know, it was a high, narrow gear, and we had many ground loops. And then the gear brakes. That is not a norm. This is an exception, but it anyway happens. With the aeroplane's center of gravity situated high above the tires, a swerve will set loose large centrifugal forces that cause the airplane to try to roll over the tires. This is true of any aeroplane, but in this scenario, the unusual camber of the Bf 109's tires creates strong directional instability, requiring a different type of control strategy for takeoffs and landings. Tight heading control or aggressive tracking of the runway center line can set off abrupt directional divergence. Better for the pilot to relax, merely damping heading changes and accept small heading errors. And that brings me to my next point. Every single aircraft you have ever seen in your life, and every single aircraft that has ever existed on this planet, and every single aircraft that will ever exist, will have certain flaws and certain advantages. And the aim for aircraft designer is that overall the aircraft is able to fulfill its role and presents a net gain over the losses that you have to essentially accept by the design itself. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about the A6M20, it doesn't matter if we talk about the F4 Phantom 2, it doesn't matter if we talk about the Fairey Swordfish, it also doesn't matter if we talk about a Spitfire. That's a big book, by the way, that's a really good book. Or any of the many World War II aircraft that the US produced, or the IL-2, or heck, even the Focke-Wulf FW-190, you know? And of course we will also arrive at the Bf 109. All of these aircraft have certain flaws. That's just a given. So let's explore that a little bit more. The Bf-109 was a lightweight, high-performance machine similar to the Supermarine Spitfire, but nowadays similar designs are sometimes remembered for different reasons. For example, few people criticize the Spitfire for its ground handling, even though it also had some issues. On the other hand, the issues with ground clearance on its propellers and the center of gravity are sometimes highlighted, whereas with the Bf-109 this tends to be less the case. With the Bf-109 or Me-109, same thing really, Germans use both designations. The fact that it was so iconic, let's move that out of the way, the fact that it was so iconic might lead to this tendency to overemphasize the gear problem. I don't know, maybe. I think one contributing factor certainly to the problems with the Bf-109 and why so many stories exist is that the Germans did not have a two-seater trainer aircraft where new pilots could be eased into the handling of the 109 with an instructor on board. Before they were sat in a Bf-109, they usually were sitting in low-performance aircraft with quite docile handling characteristics, typical trainer aircraft. That only changed later on when the Germans rolled out with the two-seater Bf-109 G12 trainer aircraft. So a lot of the issues pilots must have had initially with their new fighter aircraft were due to a problem with training and instruction, which increased the likelihood of accidents. But once you actually got used to the aircraft, there is as of yet very little evidence that I know of that the 109 had a substantially higher accident rate than comparable machines at the time because of only the gear. Now, a cursory glance at some of the Bf-109 losses actually confirms this, because in some of the Jagdgeschwaders we actually have the information, but that doesn't really reveal anything out of the ordinary. Now, of course, nowadays it's hard to pinpoint the exact cause of taxiing, takeoff or landing incidents, because usually very little information is given on top of the cause. Takeoff and landings are generally very critical moments in an aircraft's life anyway, and the plane could have been lost from a simple hole in the ground over to an inattentive, totally exhausted pilot who has been flying 3 missions a day for the last week or so. But if we look at some of these accident rates in more detail, they don't really strike me as much higher than comparable machines from other countries. Now, depending on what book you read, you sometimes see that the Bf-109 is supposed to have suffered like 10,000 aircraft losses due to the gear. This claim is sometimes brought back to Steinhoff, who was a World War II ace and who seems to have written this once in a letter. Now, he was a well-known German ace and also served in the Bundeswehr after West Germany got a new army. Although it is without a doubt that the issues with the ground looping cause accidents due to the aforementioned issues with the training regimes of the Luftwaffe at the time, I personally have to question Steinhoff's estimate a little bit. 10,000 aircraft would constitute nearly 30% of all Bf-109s produced. If it was that bad, the plane would not have been produced. No matter how much you might argue that Messerschmitt could have or would have lobbied the Reichsluftfahrtsministerium, a plane that stands a statistical chance of becoming a write-off on every third flight will not get built. Now let's look at some actual numbers here. In between July 1940 and the summer of 1942, Jagdgeschwader 2 suffers 350 losses with their Bf-109s. Mind you, by the end of that statistic, they are actually transitioning to FW-190s, but I'm just going to ignore those cases for now because it's a different plane. Now, within that list of losses, you have about 40 that happen during takeoff, landing, and taxiing, and so on with 109s. Were we to assume that all of them are the result of the gear, which is unlikely, but let's just roll with it, we arrive at a figure of about 11%, which actually is quite reasonable as an overall accident rate considering the time, and that's what it is. Now, if we compare that, for example, with the United States Army Air Force Statistical Digest as a whole, we have about 5,300 fighter losses in the ETO from June 1942 to May 1945. Around 1,200 are lost due to causes other than enemy fighters or AA. And this figure amounts then to roughly 22%. Now, sadly, those cases aren't broken down because the Statistical Digest doesn't do that. But my assumption would be that if you apply the same criteria to these numbers as with those that we had with Jagdgeschwader 2, then we would arrive at a ballpark number of anywhere between 10 to 15% of accident rates. That's an assumption, of course. You'd have to go through the actual files for the fighter wings to make sure that you get the correct ratios. But overall, somewhere between 10 to 15% is a very standard accident rate at the time. However, these ratios are affected more than just the pilots. For example, should a lot of pilots get shot down over a smaller stretch of time, the accident ratio automatically goes down because less pilots survive long enough to have an accident. And that actually reminds me, it would be interesting to see if the Luftwaffe accident rates go down at the end of the year simply because they lose more pilots in combat. That's maybe something to look into at some point. Considering that we have established that the BF-109 wasn't ideal, but also wasn't as bad as sometimes it's made out to be, did the Messerschmitt company ever try changing anything about their gear design? Well, yes, there were attempts. For example, the BF-109 V23 tested a tricycle landing gear, and V31 went with a wide undercarriage. However, continuous problems prevented further development. With the development of the 209, we also see a plane that was meant to have a wide-mounted undercarriage, while the 309 returned to the tricycle landing gear configuration. None of these projects were realized. I think it's important nowadays that before we judge, if we judge, to understand why things were done in a certain way back then when it comes to aircraft designs in World War II, and why the obvious solution that we might think about wasn't followed through back then. It's easy to say that something was a fatal flaw if one does not look at the situation as a whole. And in this example, when changing the gear, well, remember, you're not just changing the gear. Not only were the tests anything but auspicious with the wide undercarriages on the BF-109s, the gear itself is a critical component in the design, and any substantial changes to it require substantial changes to the actual aircraft itself. And I'm not only talking about electrical cables here or hydraulic lines. I am talking about a complete redesign of the aircraft's wing. The 109's wing would never have been able to hold the gear as it was. It just doesn't fit, and it wasn't built to hold it. You need a new wing, and suddenly you are no longer talking about just changing the location of the wheel and a strut, as well as a few cables, but about the lift-producing buggers sticking out of either side of your aircraft. Now, you're talking about a change that affects weight distribution. It affects performance, drag, handling, and so on. And that's before you even look at the impact this will have on production. High-intensity military production, as we see during World War II, does not just handle big design changes well. You have to retrain workers, retool factories, reorganize assembly lines, establish new production chains, invest more resources into the aircraft. The list goes on and on and on. Now, smaller design changes can be made on the fly, like when the wing changes happen from the E model to the F model in the 109. But those are small changes compared to making a whole new wing design that can hold a gear. Coming up with something completely new and way more complex, production is going to be severely affected for several months even. And in a total war scenario, that really only makes sense if the problems of the narrow undercarriage greatly outweigh the loss in factory production, which it didn't. I hope you guys enjoyed this look at the BF-109's gear. If you are a patron or a channel member, thank you very much for your support. You make this sort of content and also my Inside the Cockpit series possible because, well, they would certainly not be made by any of the traditional media out there. If you like what you saw today, please consider supporting us via Patreon or channel memberships. That really allows us to push out more content like this. And if that's not an option for you, don't worry, I understand. Please consider sharing the video and subscribing to make sure that you will also catch the next one. As always, I will leave you with a couple of viewing recommendations here. Once again, my Inside the Cockpit series right here. BF-109 has been filmed as well, so you can check that out. And then I am adding another look here at a German company, Focke-Wulf, of course, with the FW190. That video will be right here. So as always, as you go off watching those, I wish you guys a great day and see you in the sky.